Well, hello everyone, and welcome to episode 10 of Dimwits, Dipshots, Dufuses, and Dullards. And as I often note, I say dipshots because YouTube likes to censor a podcast if they swear within the first few minutes of an episode. So it's a little bit of self censorship, but you can thank YouTube for that. Anyway, this episode is about Europe rearming as fallout of Trump's Ukraine policy. And I'm not so much going to get into the ridiculous, you know, the shouting that Trump and Vance did against Ukraine's leader. I mean, that almost speaks for itself. It was just ridiculous. They kept on saying that uh, he wasn't saying thank you. Yeah, you can find clip after clip of him thanking the United States for providing weapons to Ukraine. So it was BS right from the start. But anyway, this is more about a sort of global realignment that is happening. In light of recent geopolitical shifts, European Union or EU leaders are convening emergency discussions to rapidly bolster their defense budgets. And I'm also going to go into Joe Biden's legacy, which at times was actually pretty rotten. And I'm going to discuss a fellow named Bork. You know, what's his name again? Oh, yeah, Robert Bork, whose, legacy is also a bit rotten. So the talks at the EU, have an urgency that stems from the Trump administration's recent indications that Europe should assume greater responsibility for its own security, coupled with the suspension of U.S. military aid to Ukraine. So this is really Trump's policy shift, even more than it is, the European Union. It's really his decision. He is turning his back on the obligations that the United States signed up for, a long time ago with, these other countries. So President Trump's recent actions have disrupted long-standing assumptions regarding US commitment as a security ally. His administration's warmer stance toward Russia and the cessation of support for Ukraine have raised alarms across Europe. On March 3rd, I almost said thirst, on March 3rd, 2025, in other words, just 3 days ago, as far as this episode are concerned, Trump ordered an indefinite halt to all U.S. military assistance to Ukraine, aiming to pressure President Vladimir Zelensky, or Volodymyr, I don't know exactly how his first name is pronounced, Volodymyr Zelensky, into peace negotiations with Russia. And the reason Zelensky hesitates to have these, peace negotiations is pretty straightforward. Putin has previously violated them, as if he was ever going to take them seriously in the first place. That was sort of a joke because he's the one who chose to launch the invasion. So these are all challenges facing the EU. The EU is confronting significant internal challenges as well. The rise of hard right factions, often sympathetic to Russia, has fragmented the political landscape. Major member states are also grappling with domestic uncertainties, complicating unified responses to external threats. And you can read about these issues in Le Monde, which is, I believe, a French publication. The Guardian also is a good source on these issues. And, of course, there's always a defense spending dilemma here. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, European defense expenditures have risen as perhaps a necessary result. Unless you're an absolute pacifist, you're probably going to understand the point of these defense agreements. So funds have been allocated to supply Ukraine and replenish European arsenals, but escalating demand has driven up costs. To address this, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has proposed an 800 billion euro defense plan, which marks a pivotal moment for Europe and Ukraine. And again, go ahead and look that up in The Guardian, which is, in my opinion, one of the more reliable sources. And what is the UK's stance? So their position kind of makes this more complicated because UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer dismissed claims of a rift between Europe and the US over Ukraine, emphasizing the importance of the US as an ally, which is kind of funny because it's not Europe that is, de-emphasizing the importance of that. It's actually Donald Trump. So it seems like this Starmer guy is, shifting blame as well, sort of inverting reality on its head by suggesting that, well, he's basically both sidesing it here. He's claiming that Europe is actually just as much to blame when it's really not that way. So Starmer is actively working to align the US, Ukraine, and European partners to achieve lasting peace in Ukraine. I mean, maybe he's trying to get on Trump's good side in this by both sidesing it, but again, it's unlikely to work because, you know, Trump is unreasonable. It's like talking to a stupid brick wall. And, Trump is acting as if Ukraine was the aggressor here when, of course, they were not. They were the ones who were attacked. So during a visit to a shipyard in northwest England, Starmer reiterated his call for a ceasefire backed by robust security guarantees for Ukraine, highlighting the UK's readiness to contribute to peace efforts, perhaps, or you might want to call them something else, like maybe he's just, on the pathway to letting Vladimir Putin take over Europe. That's another way of looking at it, perhaps. And, you can read about that in a lot of different sources, AP News, if you want to look at Keir Starmer's position. So that there are divergent views within the EU, of course. Discussions about enhancing Europe's defense capabilities have revealed differing perspectives among EU leaders. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has expressed reservations about relying on France's nuclear deterrent, but supports increasing defense spending. Conversely, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has threatened to veto the EU's support statement for Ukraine, which of course indicates that he's yet another one of these people who is on Putin's side. It's not just a little bit of an internal division. It's also, the de facto declaration of allegiance to the invader. And Russia's reaction, I mean, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has criticized the Franco British peace proposal and cautioned against deploying NATO peacekeepers in Ukraine. And, there's no secret why they would do that. And of course, there's the issue of financial constraints. While the need for increased defense spending is clear, many EU nations face fiscal limitations due to high national debts. So, this financial strain poses challenges to rapidly scaling up military budgets. Nonetheless, Germany has proposed a 500 billion euro fund to enhance defense capabilities, and the EU is considering a 150 billion euro loan scheme alongside greater fiscal flexibility to unlock 650 billion euros in new spending. Then there's France's initiative, In response to the U.S. cessation of intelligence sharing with Ukraine, France has stepped in to provide military intelligence. French President Emmanuel Macron has urged Europe to be prepared to defend Ukraine without U.S. assistance, emphasizing the necessity of arming Ukraine to deter further Russian territorial ambitions. And, this is amidst ongoing Russian aggression. Keep in mind that's, the reality. Amid these developments, Russia has continued its aggressive actions, including a deadly missile strike in President Zelensky's hometown. This escalation has prompted EU leaders to consider robust measures to enhance continental security. So, what's my perspective on this? My personal perspective, from a broader standpoint, these developments highlight the inherent issues within state centric power structures. The reliance on hierarchical institutions and centralized authority often leads to conflicts driven by state interests rather than the well being of individuals. That's really what's ultimately at play here. The suspension of aid to Ukraine and the subsequent rush to increase military spending by EU nations can be seen as perpetuating a cycle of violence and power struggles among nation states, even though military aid may be, and in my view, is necessary, especially in the short term. It shouldn't be overlooked that all of this is going to perpetuate the cycle of violence. There needs to be, some stronger agreement at some point among these powers and really more among the populations of these countries to, just stop this nonsense. So I still argue that true security arises from mutual aid, voluntary cooperation, and the dismantling of coercive institutions that seek war at every opportunity. The imperialistic ambition, the hyper nationalism, all that crap that really is setting the clock back. It's looking more like the 1940s or the 1930s, whenever you want to say that the World War stuff really um, took things to a more dangerous scale, with the risk of nuclear destruction and all that stuff too to be considered. So the current situation, I think it highlights the pitfalls of nationalism and militarism and suggests a need to explore alternative forms of organization that prioritize human needs over geopolitical dominance and childlike understandings of the world. So the EU's emergency talks to boost defense spending reflect a reaction to shifting U.S. policies and ongoing Russian aggression. However, again, from a broader perspective, this response may only reinforce existing power dynamics and fail to address the root causes of conflict, unfortunately. That's if the populations of all the countries involved don't, get more involved themselves and hold power accountable and put a stop to all this kind of stuff. The people need to take initiative. All right, so I'm going to grab a quick drink of water here because I've been rambling on. And now I'm going to talk about the peripheral poophead of the week, and that is Joe Biden. So, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., or as Kyle Kalinski's called him, Joseph Raisinette Biden Jr., he was born on November 20th, 1942. Obviously, he's an American politician. He served as the 46th President of the United States from 2021 to 2025. Member of the Democratic Party. He was the 47th Vice President under President Barack Obama from 2009 to 2017. And he was a representative of Delaware, and the U.S. Senate from 1973 to 2009. And he was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania, as he lets people know all the time. He, completed his undergraduate studies at the University of Delaware in 1965, earned a law degree from Syracuse University College of Law in 1968, although he lied about his credentials a little bit, which actually made him withdraw from a previous presidential run, I believe in 1988. And, let's get into his political career. Biden's political journey began with his election in the Newcastle County Council in 1970. 2 years later, in 1972, he secured a seat in the U.S. Senate, becoming one of the youngest senators in history. And, now I think he was one of the oldest presidents in history. During his tenure, he played a pivotal role in drafting and advocating for significant legislation, including the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, more on that later, and the Violence Against Women Act, which, as far as I know, was mostly a good law. So I'm not just going to trash talk him here. I'm going to try to give him a fair shake when it's relevant. Additionally, he presided over 6 U.S. Supreme Court confirmation hearings, notably those of Robert Bork and Clarence Thomas. So, giving him some credit once again, Joe Biden voted against confirming Clarence Thomas. So he did try to keep him off the Supreme Court, which in my view was a good thing. So Biden sought the Democratic presidential nomination in both 1988 and 2008, but was unsuccessful in those two occasions. So, this is somebody who obviously really wanted to be president. In 2008, Barack Obama selected him as his running mate, serving as vice president from 2009 to 2017. Biden was a close advisor to President Obama, probably in many instances giving him bad advice. In the 2020 presidential election, he secured the Democratic nomination and chose Senator Kamala Harris as his running mate, and they defeated the incumbent Republican ticket of President Donald Trump and Vice President Mike Pence, making Biden the first president to serve alongside a female vice president. So, nothing sounds that bad so far, right? During his presidency, Biden signed the American Rescue Plan to address the COVID 19 pandemic and the ensuing economic recession. He also enacted bipartisan legislation focusing on infrastructure and manufacturing. Although the proposed Build Back Better Act did not pass in Congress, elements of it were incorporated into the Inflation Reduction Act, which he signed into law in 2022. Biden appointed Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court, which was a significant milestone. Now, here's where things get, you know, more iffy, and it really involves Netanyahu. So, in terms of foreign policy, the U.S. rejoined the Paris Agreement under Biden's leadership, which I think was good. He oversaw the complete withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan, ending a 2 decade long conflict. That was a good thing overall, but had mixed results to say the least. The withdrawal led to the rapid collapse of the Afghan government and the Taliban's rise to power. But it should be remembered that that agreement was actually largely Donald Trump's agreement, and Donald Trump had actually freed some of the key Taliban officials. That was an oopsie from Trump more than it was from Biden. So, in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Biden's administration imposed sanctions on Russia and authorized both civilian and military aid to Ukraine, which were mostly good things. You know, it was actually self defense. And during the Gaza conflict, or you might want to say the Gaza genocide, Biden condemned Hamas's actions as terrorism, which is fair, but he also expressed strong support for Israel's military response and facilitated limited at best humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip, But of course, Netanyahu has pledged to stop all humanitarian aid from getting into Gaza. And, he's killed about 100,000 plus Palestinians. And that's according to the Lancet Medical Journal. You'll hear a lot of figures that say it's like 40,000 or 40 something plus. But really, those are old figures and they're not really keeping the most reliable body count figures right now. So, according to Al Jazeera, because Biden kept arming the genocide and providing diplomatic cover, he, paved the way for what Trump is doing there. He alienated progressive voters and Palestinian and Muslim voters, and Trump was able to better secure a victory in 2024. So Al Jazeera notes that Trump recently said this: "This is your last warning." I'm quoting Trump now. "This is your last warning. For the leadership, now is the time to leave Gaza while we still have a chance." And Trump also said, "Also to the people of Gaza, a beautiful future awaits, but not if you hold hostages. If you do, you are dead. Make a smart decision." So, yeah, he's making it very clear that he's, you know, sending a death threat to the people of Gaza in general. So Al Jazeera continues, "The president's comment came hours after the White House confirmed that Washington is engaging in talks with Hamas. Trump has been calling for the forced displacement of Gaza's entire population and for the U.S. to own the Palestinian territory." So just taking it over, you know, imperialism, you know, claiming of territory, stealing territory. So Al Jazeera continues, "It is unclear how the beautiful future Trump promised residents of Gaza would fit into his ethnic cleansing plan. Trump previously said under his proposal, Palestinians would not be able to return to the territory." So remember, Joe Biden actually paved the way for that. Keep that in mind. So, Biden's political career reflects a commitment to maintaining and reinforcing violent state structures, often at odds with decent principles, humanitarian ideals. In 1994, as a senator, Biden was instrumental in the passage of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. This legislation led to an increase in police funding, the militarization of police, and failures to hold them accountable for abuse or outright murder, and the expansion of the prison system, including the private prison system, for profit prisons, policies that progressives criticize for perpetuating violence and systemic oppression. The 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 thing that you know law and order are supposed to prevent. So during the 2020 presidential campaign, Biden condemned arsonists, during the BLM protests, stating that they should be prosecuted, which, I think most people would agree with. Yet he has no problem with supporting genocidal campaigns, as I previously discussed. And of course, we all know that arson and rioting is not necessarily the end of the world anyway, as sports riots are a thing. There recently were some sports riots. But as soon as there is a politically tinged riot, or even a peaceful protest, suddenly the right wing media, and in some cases, prominent corporate Democrats, treat it like it's the end of the world and they call for restrictions on free speech and all that kind of stuff. And of course, the more you crack down on populations and restrict their speech, the more likely they are to lash out anyway, unless you're talking about pure 100% authoritarianism, which, will quote unquote solve the problem, but you have people living in fear and a lot of draconian and totalitarian elements take over the society. So, most of those who oppose the abuses of supposed state imposed law and order, only oppose it when it does not actually provide law and order, but actually just unleashes unconstitutional chaos. So, upon assuming the presidency, Biden revoked an executive order from the previous administration that sought to designate cities like New York, Portland, and Seattle as quote unquote anarchist jurisdictions to withhold federal funding. So that was actually something good that Joe Biden did. And while this action was seen as a reversal of a stupid, nonsensical, made up punitive measure from Trump and his DOJ, it did not signify support for, you know, anything that was really that great. It was just a return to conventional federal city relations. And, it's one of those things that it's it's not really anything that was that significant. There was there was a nonsensical thing that Trump did, designating those areas as quote unquote anarchist jurisdictions. And then he just, you know, reverse course on it. So that's another thing that'll give Biden credit for. But it really had minimal impact. And in the aftermath of the 2020 election, Biden failed to be more progressive. And even when he did the right thing, he often did a piss poor job of promoting it. His approval rating was also deep underwater toward the 2024 election, which led him to step down from his campaign, and Kamala was essentially anointed the leader. So, criticism of that aside, Kamala had to scramble her resources together with limited time, and in some ways had to clean up Joe Biden's mess after he totally botched that presidential debate. It was such a miserable failure of a debate that even people who had supported Joe Biden, they were like, "Oh, you got to step down. You can't run in 2024 anymore." His previous supporters were like, "Nah, we're not going to back this horse anymore." So, here's an interesting fact. If less than 115,000 votes had switched in 3 battleground states, Harris would have beaten Trump. It's sad, and yet some Democrats want to pretend that Kamala did nothing wrong or Biden did nothing wrong. Had they just made a few changes, they actually could have won, even under the current circumstances. They they could have won, and that's pretty sad for them, and I would say probably for the country as a whole. So another aspect of these old corporate Democrats sucking so bad. Now we'll never get to see Fani Willis tearing to Trump in the courtroom. I know at least one person personally who was looking forward to that day. You know, she was referring to Fani Willis as sort of a bulldog, and she was really wanting to see that happen. But now it will never arrive thanks to Joe Biden and a few bad campaign strategists who worked for Kamala Harris. And another sad thing? All Kamala had to do was lie and pretend she doesn't like Biden's atrocities against Palestinians. You know, it would have been a bad thing to lie about it, but it's it's something they do anyway. They lie anyway. But she could not pretend to care about those people. So no one successfully told her she needed progressive and Muslim voters. So she pretty much didn't even pretend to care. And it actually did hurt her chances in the election. There were millions of people who refused to support her because she didn't indicate a clear policy shift. So she just barely lost, actually, despite, dumb initial claims that Trump won by a huge I said margin. It was actually only, I think, 1.4 or 1.5%. So if the dumbass Dems would have just done a few things differently and maybe promised a minimum wage increase and universal health care, it could have translated into millions of more votes, but they just had to be fuck ups. I guess that's what you have to do. So I warned people about all these potential bad things. So I will only accept a small fraction of the blame. And every day now is a bad day for democracy, basically. Biden and Kamala dropped the ball, to say the least. And sadly, we must watch as our country descends into another era of crisis that is already underway. So, there are people who are considering leaving the country if they can. And I can't say that I don't understand that. I've considered that myself, but I just don't have the budget to do it or the overseas support. I don't know enough people overseas or whatever. I just don't have the connections to do something like that. So the Democrats lost millions of progressive votes with the whole genocide thing. That's part of the analysis that most mainstream sources will not provide, but it's as obvious as the nose on Groucho Marx's face. They literally let democracy get crushed in order to arm a genocide. So they're reprobates. And to be fair, I am impressed by how well Kamala did, despite how her own party and her own ideology stabbed itself in the back. Trump didn't need to steal the election, though. The Democrats stole it mostly from themselves by alienating a lot of their own supporters. And Trump openly admitted to many of his crimes, too. It's not like there was zero evidence of anything. He was caught red-handed doing a bunch of this shit. Hell, even in the E. Jean Carroll case, where the evidence was relatively weak, he just couldn't help but incriminate himself. During the deposition, he mistook a picture of E. Jean Carroll for his wife. Then he said rapey behavior by the rich and powerful has happened for, quote, millions of years. And he added, fortunately or unfortunately. So it was a joke to him. Also his ex wife had accused him of rape, was compelled to sign an NDA or non disclosure agreement, and then when a new election came around, she somehow died from blunt force trauma and wound up buried in one of his golf courses. So tell me that doesn't sound like an episode of Forensic Files. When the election came around, suddenly she dies. It's almost like maybe she was considering coming forward, like maybe she threatened to come forward with information about, what he did or something like that. I don't know. I don't know. But anyway, enough about that. Now I'm going to get into the fetid fever dream flashback of the week, which is Robert Bork. So, the biggest scandal involving Robert Bork was his role in the Saturday Night Massacre during the Watergate scandal in 1973. As the Solicitor General of the United States, Bork carried out President Nixon's order to fire Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox, and what a name that is, right? To have Bald Cox as part of your name. But anyway, Archibald Cox was investigating the Watergate break-in. So both Attorney General Elliot Richardson and Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus resigned rather than comply with Nixon's demand, leaving Bork, who was third in line, as the one to execute the dismissal. The move was widely seen as an abuse of executive power, undermining the rule of law and obstructing justice. So, oddly enough, as so often happens, people like Robert Bork actually make anarchist critiques of government seem valid. So, what do I mean by that? Well, let's look at this from sort of an anarchic lens here. So, an anarchist perspective on the Bork scandal would be something like this. From the anarchist viewpoint, Bork's actions in the Saturday Night Massacre exemplify the dangers of centralized authority and the state's ability to suppress accountability. So, several key anarchist critiques could emerge when discussing this. You got state power and corruption. Bork's compliance with Nixon's order highlights how state officials often prioritize loyalty to power over justice. These terrible, evil anarchists would argue that hierarchical institutions like the government and legal system, inevitably serve the interests of the ruling class more than they do the people. So, this story goes to, benefit the demonic anarchists. So, you also have legalism as a tool of oppression. While some defend Bork by saying he acted legally within his role, vile anarchist critique would see this as an example of how legality and justice do not always align. Laws often exist to protect those in power rather than ensure fairness, and Bork's role in obstructing a legitimate investigation really only underscores that. A pathetic and dangerous anarchist would argue about the futility of political reform. Anarchists often see events like Watergate as proof that political reforms, such as independent investigations, cannot truly check state power or could only rarely guarantee checks on state power. The very fact that Nixon could attempt a cover up of a crime using legal mechanisms and willing enforcers like Bork demonstrates the systemic flaws of government, and governance. And you also have the critique that hierarchies enable authoritarianism. Gee, why would some people argue that? Why would they claim that? Well, Bork's position as an unelected bureaucrat making a major decision highlights how political hierarchies enable undemocratic actions. These sinister anarchists advocate for decentralized, non hierarchical systems where power is not concentrated in the hands of a few. So, they would argue that their method will almost inherently place checks on authoritarianism because they're not hierarchical. So they would sort of disallow authoritarianism to take shape. So, from a dastardly anarchist lens, Robert Bork's role in the Saturday Night Massacre illustrates the inherent dangers of state power. His actions did not reflect individual corruption alone, but were a symptom of a system designed to protect itself at all costs. Rather than being an anomaly, Bork's actions fit into a broader anarchist critique that centralized authority is fundamentally prone to abuse, making true accountability impossible or at least improbable within a hierarchical state structure. So, you know, it's yet another example of the government itself lending credibility to radical critiques. So, if these relatively conservative politicians and, you know, Republicans or whatever want to make it so that the radical left has nothing to talk about, well, ironically, they would just have to step aside and, let the population actually have power, because then there would be no legitimate critiques of said power. Now, would there? There wouldn't be these abuses of power to criticize. There wouldn't be these tendencies toward authoritarianism or, cultural supremacy or what have you. You know, they would just be left alone. And they could they could go about their own business as normal human beings and not be subject to scrutiny and all that kind of stuff. But instead, they insist on putting themselves in positions of power and, exposing themselves to these far left spooky critiques. That's sort of a built-in solution. If you just step aside, you don't have to put up with these pesky critics. So that's about it for today's episode, and you know I'll presumably be back here next week to talk about a fresh crop of issues.